welcome to all of our attendees this morning. We are redoing the excavation and trenching toolbox talk. And so let's get straight into it this morning, where we take a look at your general safety regulations, section 13. Now, when you're doing demolition, excavations, and trenching, every employer must perform building work in accordance with what legislation requires. Now, if you look on the left-hand side of the page, you can see why legislation has put this there. It's obvious from the picture that should excavations collapse, the walls of the excavations or the shoring of the excavations collapse, we put our employees in a very high risk situation. In fact, we put many in a high risk situation, even those who might be working in and around the excavation. And so every employer who performs this type of building work will do it, obviously make sure that all necessary precautions are taken. And this is not inclusive of all the requirements, but they are saying adequate shoring. Now, what is adequate shoring? And many of you have sent me pictures of the site you're working on, saying, hey Chris, is this correct? And I'll give you feedback either on WhatsApp or on email. And I'd like to say thank you very much for doing that, because it gives me a little bit of insight into what you are doing or putting yourself into every single day. But now take a look at what the law says again, and this is again a recap of what we did last year when we spoke about excavations. The necessary precautions in the form of adequate shoring, now, or such other means as may be necessary to prevent the accidental collapse of any part of the structure or of any adjoining structure. And now that was the question you raised. Why is it that some of you are doing shoring, and why do some sites where you're working on not have shoring? And that plumber or that contractor is not being moaned at by the safety officer, but when they come to you, then they seem to have an issue. Well, let us take a look again, and this is just a reminder from last year's discussion on what is shoring or what is adequate protection. Remember, the goal is to prevent the collapse of the shoring. Now, in these three pictures, these are the types of good practice, either from shoring or to ensure that there is sufficient protection in order to stabilize the actual excavation. Now, either you are going to ensure that you cut it back, as you can see on the very first picture on the left hand side, cutting it back obviously at different angles. It all depends on the actual type of excavation you're doing. It depends on how deep you're going. It depends on the soil that you're working with. It also depends on what buildings or what structures are actually around you. And so it might not be practical to go this way. And this is the type of shoring that many are doing on site, and saying that it is not adequate enough or there's not enough space to do this. Well, then you have the other two options, as you see there in the middle picture or on the right hand side. Now, this is bracing. Obviously, the bracing that you're going to be putting inside here is ensured that it is braced, as the name suggests, on the sides to prevent the collapse of the walls from inside out. Now, in order to do this right, you also have to set up and do your inspection very, very well. And the reason why we say that is, while this type of bracing is being put up, oftentimes we are finding that the walls are already collapsing or already pushing down. And so we find that many sites, a lot of the guys who are doing bulk earthworks or doing the cutting for you and then allowing you to come in afterwards and do your shoring or bracing, depending on what you need, we are realizing that many of them cut the entire trench or cut the entire excavation. And by doing that, there is no adequate protection in that excavation. Now, in order to get your tools and equipment, you have to send somebody in there. And so this is where the danger really exists. So what we are suggesting is that you do it obviously in stages. Do it in accordance with the size of your bracing. Now, shoring, great stuff. If you have the space and you realize at what angle or what degree you're doing your shoring, and you know exactly that you have enough space in order to do this, please ensure that you do this before you put any person into that excavation. Why? Well, General Safety Regulation Section 13B, you are not required or allowed to permit any person to work under unsupported hanging material or in an excavation which is more than 1.5 meters deep, which has not been adequately shored or braced. So please remember, you cannot put somebody in there unless it has been braced. Now you ask me, and this was one of the questions that came out, what if it is the person that has to put the shoring in? Well, now how do you ensure that that person is safe before the shoring has gone up? And this is the age-old question, same as working at heights. Somebody who's building a scaffold has to hook onto what? Well, if there's nothing above them and the scaffold that they're hooking onto is currently not actually signed off, is it adequate as an anchor point? Well, remember the law is saying adequately shored, adequate for the scope or purpose or task that you're performing. Now it's understandable and it's reasonable and practical to know that when you are setting up, there is a higher measure of danger until the actual setup is complete. But what does this actually mean? Well, it means that you need to take more precaution when you start an excavation than during an excavation, as well as at the end of excavation when those protective barriers are coming down. Now, we're not saying at all that once you are in an excavation and everything is adequately shored and braced that you can let your guard down. Not at all. We're not saying that at all. What we are saying is that when you set up initially, you need to do a little bit more than just what is minimum required according to the law. And that is because you are putting somebody in a dangerous situation where this excavation or trench, which obviously is not adequately shored at this stage because you're still setting it up, and this is something that you will need to then prepare and plan for adequately. And again, what is the whole goal of ensuring that it is either shored, like you see on the left-hand side, or the middle and right-hand picture adequately braced? Well, it is to prevent the sides of that excavation from collapsing. Now, how does an excavation collapse? Well, there are many different ways, but here we're going to show you 4 pictures. As you can see there on the right hand side, soil that is placed in, or sorry, not in, but around the actual excavation could shift and fall in to the excavation. If you look to the top right hand side, you could see that the wall of the excavation, or the soil that is basically the barricade of the excavation, could then also shift, and this could cause soft soil moving downward with the weight of that soil then moving with the soft soil, and this could then cause a collapse inside the actual excavation as well. Looking at the bottom left hand side, a slice, again it depends on the soil that you're dealing with, but this could happen where a piece like a wall of the actual excavation, because of the soil, the type of soil that you're dealing with, could then collapse over on top of a person. And then you can see on the last picture on the bottom right hand corner there, the excavation, the entire wall inside kind of forms like a cavity, and the midsection of the wall then crumbles and falls over. Each one of these scenarios basically is something that we need to avoid, because if you have somebody inside there, if you have tools or equipment inside there, obviously there's a very big possibility for loss of life due to engulfment from that soil, or there's a huge possibility of loss of production and damage to your tools and equipment. And so again, coming back to the legislation, General Safety Regulations Section 13, now moving on to Section C, tells us that any person who's going to be working in an excavation or planning for an excavation, and here we are really talking about you supervisors, managers, owners of the company, you need to take steps to ensure that any support, whether it's shoring or bracing, as we saw in paragraph B, is designed and constructed so that it is strong enough to support the sides of the excavation in question. So there's nothing worse than thinking you have got a safe excavation, you've put in shoring, you've put in bracing, and yet we haven't determined the weight of the actual wall or the weight of the soil that could impact the excavation. And then our shoring collapses or even our bracing collapses or fails to support it. And so how would we actually know what is the correct type of shoring? What is the correct type of bracing? Well, again, this is not a course obviously on excavations. Your excavation supervisor as well as your excavation inspector will know and understand those risks and hazards related to any types of excavations, as well as the soft in situ soil. Obviously, there's going to be ground conditions that we have to consider. There's buildings and structures that we have to consider. In fact, if we take a look at the next slide, we also have to ensure that we even consider the moving vehicles or the construction vehicles or the plant that might be moving in and around the site that we are working on. And this is what we call a zone of influence. Now, the reason why it's called a zone of influence because it influences the structural integrity of your excavation or trench. Now, again, we'll just go back to the legislation, and this is just in detail again of what the legislation is telling us. At General Safety Regulations section 13, and now we're going to look at subsection D, it says where the stability of an adjoining building, structure or road is likely to be affected by demolition work on a building or the making of an excavation, you must take the steps necessary to ensure the stability of the building, the structure or the road and the safety of persons. And so we need to understand what is that zone of influence. Well, this means your excavation supervisor as well as your excavation inspector must come out and double check the entire excavation and see whether it measures up to the correct safety standard. Now you'll notice in this picture the soil that has been removed from this excavation has not been placed 1 meter away from the excavation. No, it's been placed 1 meter away from the angle of zone of influence. And so if the plant or truck that you see on the left hand side was allowed to drive within that zone of influence, well, that could potentially cause the truck and soil to collapse into the excavation. And the same with the excavated soil that you see on the right hand side. Perhaps it was only 1 meter from the excavation and not the zone of influence. Well, that amount of soil adds more weight to that excavated area. And that weight on that side of the wall could potentially crumble or make your structure fail. And then whether it's shoring or whether it's bracing, it's not going to be adequately protected. And so again, we come back to ensuring it is stable. So when you are doing excavation, please make sure that you have a qualified, competent excavation supervisor as well as a competent excavation inspector. They can be the same person, but this person or persons must know and understand how excavation works, how trenching works, how shoring works, and also what adequate bracing needs to be used and where the zone of influence is to protect any buildings, structures, roads, plant, and especially the safety of persons. And ultimately, that is our goal. We want to protect the person inside of that excavation. So carrying on with the law again, one of the things that many plumbers have asked, it was another question. In fact, it was a question that came after this Toolbox talk last year. And I know it was late last year, and so this is just a very big reminder to everyone about excavations because it is so serious. A lot of plumbers are dealing with it, having quite a few hassles. And one of the things that you are asking is, who is responsible for checking whether there are any services where you're going to be digging or where you're going to be putting excavation and trenching? And so it's a difficult question because a lot of times you are not quoting for that, but you are also leaving it out of your terms and conditions on your quote. And then I see a lot of plumbers are saying, well, inside the quote, our terms and conditions state that we do not check for services unless we are requested to check for it. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to run your business. Please, that is your relationship with your client. And the fact that you're in business means you are running it better than I am. And I am not a plumber. I do work along with plumbers, and so what we did was we decided to go out on a few sites, spoke to a couple of clients, and we interviewed one of the clients out there who also happens to be a plumber, and we chatted to them about how they go about ensuring that whether there's electricity, water, or gas, or any other similar services. And what they basically say is they start off by quoting the client for that service. Then they specifically state in that quote that these services are X amount, and should the client not need these services, they need to provide either their own scan or drawings or plans, or a letter confirming that there are no services in that area. And that way, it's not a, I've damaged your services, let's go back to see what our quote or invoice said. It's being upfront with the client. The client then either states they don't need the services to be scanned for because they know in that area there are no services, and should anything be wrong, at least from the client's perspective, they were the ones who issued or gave the authority in order not to scan for this. And so terms and conditions are one of the things that we can put on quotes and invoices. Obviously everybody's got them, you know, that fine print, but rather to see whether your fine print is saving you or saving your client, or potentially harming the relationship. And so again, I'm not going to tell you how to run your business. It was just a very good suggestion from this client of ours who is a plumber, who does state it up front. Many clients then request for it to be taken off of the quote, and once that is taken off of the quote, then liability then shifts obviously over to the client. But again, the plumbers on site, and this is one thing that the supervisor stated on site, they will always go and do an inspection, and while digging they are super careful, especially where it looks like there may be services in place. And so they don't just go in and destroy the whole yard or area where they're going to be working in. They also work carefully even though the client has not requested those services to be scanned for. But again, what does the law say about the person performing the excavations? And this is where some clients have overruled a contractor who never stated that they would or wouldn't look for services. In other words, it wasn't quoted for, and it wasn't being told to the client that they should look for it. Well, the client won in this case because the law says that any person who's performing excavations must ascertain as far as practical the location and nature of water, electricity, gas, or similar services that may be affected. And so please understand, this is speaking about the person doing the excavations, not necessarily the client paying for it. All right, so excavations also must have adequate entrance and exit, or entry and egress. So safe access is very important, but we also want to ensure that the safe access that we put up is also far away from any other hazard that may be present. And so in this picture you can see there's drums that are at least 1 meter away from the actual excavated area. This gives a nice walking corridor, aisle that somebody can walk down, climb onto the ladder. In fact, the ladder access as well must protrude at least 1 meter above the actual surface where that person, or landing where that person is going to climb off, and that is to ensure that he can adequately climb on and climb off of that safe access. And it must have adequate supports as well. In the picture it looks like the ladder is kind of loose, but that's just a representation of why the ladder should be there for safe entry and safe exit, and then also ensuring that it is above 1 meter. It's also at an angle of 45 degrees, or the 1:4 ratio for ladders and how they should be set up as well. Now if you're using scaffolding, well, just go according to your SANS 1885 and make sure that you have adequate egress, you can get out of the scaffold, and adequate entrance so that you can adequately get into it safely. But also any excavation that is 1.5 meter deep or deeper must ensure that you have proper solid and stable access and egress. So that ladder must definitely be secured both at the top and at the bottom. Now also, if your excavation or trench is going to be more then 50 meters in length. You must also have entrance and exits points within those 50-meter intervals. And again, this is where reasonable and practical. This is how your actual excavation or plan for excavation has been set up. Then we take a look at ensuring that all excavation, bracing and shoring is inspected by a person who is competent. Another question that came out, if I've been trained and my certificate has expired, my knowledge hasn't expired, why can I not still be a competent inspector? Well, that is true, your knowledge has not changed, but in the plumbing industry we have CPD, continual professional development. You cannot become a master plumber without doing certain courses, and even when you are a master plumber, there are certain things that you need to do in order to keep up that status as a master plumber. Now, this is the same with a competent person who does excavations. In fact, it's the same in any industry. If you want to be known as being competent, there are certain skills that are required, certain abilities that you've maintained, and knowledge that has come with obviously a lot of experience. But the proof of that is in showing that you are still competent, not just on the job, but theoretically as well by performing your assessments when you're doing training. And so please ensure that this person who has been appointed has got some sort of certificate from a qualified provider to say that this person has been tested and assessed as a competent inspector, and then ensure that that person does do it correctly. In other words, although you might not know about scaffolding, you might not know about ladders, you might not know about excavations, why not just take a look at the law? The law has it there for you. Like GSR, General Safety Regulations 13, and this again, we are coming back to section I. This is adequately protected by a barrier or fence at least 1 meter high and as close to the excavation as practical. So again, it must be as close as practical, but again, remembering your zone of influence for shoring. But if you took a look at the first few pictures that had that bracing going right up, it went 1 meter above, and that was right on the actual excavation. And that is because it was placed there strategically in order to create a barrier for nobody to be able to fall in. And so again, it must be 1 meter high from the base level, not from the excavation level. So if you are excavating down the normal ground before you excavate it, it must go from 1 meter there up, and this gives adequate protection for any person working around that excavation. All right, now finishing off with the last point, point number 2 of this excavation is to provide red warning lights or any other clearly visible boundary indicators at night or when visibility conditions are poor. Now again, minimum requirements. Some of your clients have requested that you put red danger tape around your barricading as well as the actual 1 meter high fence or barrier. That is allowed. You are allowed to request more than the law requires. Why? Because this law is the minimum requirements, but it should be stated within some sort of safety specification. So we don't want you to argue or fight with your client, but remember, you need to adequately and then also ensure nobody is hurt or damaged by that excavation that you're performing. So the more signage you put, the better. At night, we obviously know this because we need red warning lights to clearly show us that there is a possibility that somebody could fall in there, or when visibility conditions are poor. And this is for any person walking or driving, and again on a construction site where any plant might be moving around.